Welcome to Part 8 of Auditing Standards number 5. Because Auditing Standards 5 has over 100 pages, I've broken it into smaller sections. This Cliff Note version is on selecting controls to test, testing design effectiveness, and testing operating effectiveness. This training gives context to SOX 404 requirements. It's meant to be an easy to understand breakdown of dense words, and because the literature, there's so many parts to the literature, I have broken it down to smaller parts, part 1, part 2, and you can see here based on your focus or the areas you're interested in, you can then listen to selected parts. And it's meant for people who need a refresher, or if it's your first time exposure to SOX 404, you can then get an overview. This table of contents came directly out of Auditing Standard 5 from the PCAOB. I've just made it into chunks so that it's easier to understand and follow. Selecting controls to test. So paragraph 39 talks about testing the controls that are important. As you might have remembered in AS2, there were lots of controls that people were testing. Anything that was called a control, people just tested. And in AS5, it's really narrowed down to controls that are important. And that's why paragraph 40 also talks about it's not necessary to test all the controls for relevant assertions or to duplicate certain controls unless the redundancy is a key objective. So again, you see now in AS5 more focused on what are key controls. And part of the decision of what controls to be selected, what are considered key controls, is whether they address the risk of misstatement. And it doesn't matter what the control is labeled. If you called it entity level controls, a monitoring control, a control activity, or preventive or detective control, that combination of does it really fit your objective? That's the key thing that we're focused on in terms of the controls, the key controls to test. Testing design effectiveness. So one of the first steps that you do, we talked about the walkthrough earlier in terms of understanding the sources of potential misstatements. And now when you do the test of design, this is where you sometimes hear TOD, test of design. It's basically, is the control designed in a way that would satisfy an objective? If you laid out, here are the 10 steps of how to do this control, and someone who's fairly competent followed those instructions as they were described or explained by you, would the control really fit our objective? And if that's the case, then it's designed effectively. An example of a control being designed well is a journal entry and having another person review and approve the journal entry. So that particular control is designed if you followed the instruction of having someone independently prepare it and then someone independently review it. That's a good design. Now, whether the people actually followed that is a different matter. But in this case, we're focused on designing the actual control itself. Is it effective? Now, here's this note on less complex companies that's saying if you have fewer employees, maybe you don't have the proper segregation of duties, but you can have compensating controls. You could design alternative controls that can still make your operation effective. Just because you're small and you don't have segregation of duties doesn't mean that all of your controls are not designed well. And in order to see if the control is designed well, here's a combination of test procedures that you can do. You can inquire, which is basically you can ask the appropriate people. You could observe, meaning you can watch them do the operation or do the particular step. You can inspect relevant documentation. And inspecting means that get a copy of the report, look through the types of pages they look at or types of items that they look at, the comments that they make. That's an inspection of the relevant documentation. And by performing a walkthrough that includes a combination of these procedures, you have now considered whether the design is effective or not. So that leads back to the couple of sections ago when I talked about performing a walkthrough and understanding transactions from beginning to processing to when it actually hits the books. You can use a combination of asking questions, observing people do it, inspect it. That's sufficient to see if the design is effective. Next is testing operating effectiveness. And testing operating effectiveness, you will sometimes hear the phrase TOE, test of effectiveness. And so remember, you can design the best controls, you can have the best laid plans, but if people are not performing the control as it was designed, if the person doing the actual control doesn't have the authority or doesn't have the competency, it's not operating effectively. So let me give you an example. Going back to the example of the journal entry. If we have a control that says someone has to prepare the journal entry and someone has to independently review the journal entry, well, the person who reviews the journal entry has to have the appropriate authority and has to really understand what they're reviewing. If you just have two people, one person who's semi-clueless and another person who's also semi-clueless reviewing the other clueless person, that doesn't make your control better or operating effective just because you have two people reviewing. You have to have a combination of understanding to probe and make sure that the review is effective, and that you have to have the authority, because maybe the person who's doing the review is at a lower level. Maybe they don't have the authority to really make sure that the control is operating effectively. And in this note, you'll see the note in paragraph 44, it talks specifically about smaller companies and saying that maybe in smaller companies, just because sometimes you don't have the ability to have a full-time person doing something, you can outsource parts of your accounting operations. It's okay as long as the auditor can assess the competence of the person or the company that the activity has been outsourced to. An example of this is very typical of our smaller clients is the equity process. Stock option administrators or stock option accounting, usually you don't need a full-time person in your smaller organization. You only need a person for a day, a month, or maybe a couple of days during the quarter end when you're trying to record your stock-based compensation or get all of your stock option grants and activities recorded. Well, in that case, if your company has outsourced it to another person, a contractor doing it, as long as that person is competent, then the auditor can say that the control is operating effectively. Now, the types of procedures to see if the control is operating effectively is very similar to test of design. You can inquire about it. You can observe someone doing it. You can inspect the relevant documentation. And finally, this is more relevant for operating effectiveness, is you can re-perform the control. Re-performance of the control literally is gather all the materials that the control owner or the process owner would have gathered, take the similar steps that they would have taken, and do you get the same results that they got? And a lot of times as SOX auditors, when we're doing some of this test of effectiveness, we border on the line of inspection plus re-performance, because sometimes we get the reports from our clients and we're not comfortable just because they've signed their name and they've made some scratches on the paper that the person has really inspected or understood what they were signing off on. So we may then add up a couple of columns, add up a couple of pages, look at the subtotals, and really see, does it make sense? And so we do a little more than the inspection, but maybe a little less than re-performance. That's just for our comfort level. And that's it on controls to test.